The storage facility loomed before me like a decaying giant, its weathered facade a testament to years of neglect. I pulled into the empty parking lot, my car's headlights casting long shadows across the crumbling asphalt. The place had been abandoned for 5 years, ever since the grisly discoveries that made national headlines. As a true crime journalist, I'd covered dozens of disturbing cases, but none quite like the Storage King killer. The emergency lighting still functioned, powered by the building's old backup generator. Somewhere in the distance, a fluorescent tube buzzed and flickered, creating an irregular strobe effect that set my nerves on edge. My footsteps echoed off the concrete walls as I made my way down the main corridor. Unit 237, that's where they found the first victim. The police reports described in clinical detail how the killer had turned an ordinary 10 by 15 storage unit into a makeshift torture chamber. I stopped at Unit 237, my flashlight beam illuminating the padlock that had replaced the one cut by police during their investigation. The original renters had never returned to claim their belongings after the unit was released from evidence. Can't say I blamed them. According to court documents, the killer had posed as a maintenance worker, targeting victims during off hours when the facility was nearly empty. He'd knock them unconscious, drag them inside, and I pushed those thoughts away, focusing instead on the story I came to write. The lock's mechanism was corroded but gave way easily to my bolt cutters. The metal door groaned as I rolled it upward, decades of rust protesting the movement. The musty smell of abandonment hit me first, followed by the metallic tang that I told myself was just oxidized metal. My flashlight revealed piles of forgotten belongings, old furniture draped in dust-covered sheets, cardboard boxes softening with age and humidity, a broken mirror propped against the back wall. The concrete floor bore dark stains that no amount of industrial cleaner had fully erased. I'd seen the crime scene photos. I knew exactly what had soaked into that concrete. The killer had kept his victims alive for days, meticulously documenting their suffering in a journal that became crucial evidence at his trial. They found traces of 8 different DNA profiles in this unit, though only 5 bodies were ever recovered. I began documenting the scene, photographing the unit's interior for my article. As I moved deeper inside, my shoe crunched on broken glass. The beam of my flashlight revealed old newspapers scattered across the floor, their headlines yellowed with age. One caught my eye: Storage King killer claims 6th victim. I recognized the victim's name, Sarah Chen, 27, a graduate student who had been storing her belongings while between apartments. Against the side wall stood a workbench, its surface still cluttered with tools left behind by investigators. The killer had used common hardware store items, transforming them into instruments of torture. A ball-peen hammer, pliers, a hand drill. Each one had been photographed, tagged, and presented as evidence during the trial. Each one had contributed to the slow deaths of multiple victims. A sound from the service corridor made me freeze. Something metallic had clattered against concrete, the echo bouncing off the walls. I killed my flashlight instantly, heart pounding. The facility was supposed to be empty. I'd gotten special permission from the property developer to visit before demolition began next week. I held my breath, listening. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness. A pipe groaned as it cooled in the evening air. My eyes drifted to the broken surveillance camera in the corner. The killer had known about the facility's security system, had known how to disable it without raising alerts. That's why they eventually concluded he must have worked there at some point. But they never found employment records matching his description. The camera hung limply from its mount, like a dead spider suspended in its web. Thunder rumbled outside as storm clouds gathered. Through a broken window, I could see the city lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. I needed to finish up before the rain started. The last thing I wanted was to be trapped here in a downpour. I turned back to the storage unit, raising my camera to capture one final series of photos. That's when I noticed something odd about the shadows in the back corner. The beam of my flashlight had caught what looked like a seam in the concrete wall, one that shouldn't have been there, according to the building plans I'd studied. I moved closer, examining the suspicious line that ran from floor to ceiling. The killer had never revealed where he'd hidden his other 3 victims. My hands trembled as I ran my fingers along the seam. A hidden door. It had to be. The kind used by maintenance workers to access plumbing and electrical systems between units. I'd seen nothing about this in the case files. My heart raced as I found a recessed handle, nearly invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. The metal was cold against my palm as I pulled. The door opened with a low groan, revealing a narrow maintenance tunnel. The beam of my flashlight disappeared into darkness. The air that whispered out was stale, carrying the faint smell of decay. My journalistic instinct screamed that this was it, the killer's true trophy room, undiscovered all these years. The place where his final victims had met their end. Something crunched under my foot as I stepped into the tunnel. I aimed my light down and felt my blood run cold. Scattered across the floor were dozens of Polaroid photographs, warped and faded with age and humidity. I forced myself to look at one, then immediately wished I hadn't. The images showed people I didn't recognize, more victims, ones that had never been connected to the case. A sound from deep in the tunnel made me jerk upright. Metal scraped against concrete, followed by footsteps. A shadow moved in the darkness beyond my flashlight's reach. The killer was serving multiple life sentences. I'd verified his prison records myself just last week, but his confession had hinted at an accomplice, someone who'd helped him dispose of bodies, someone who'd never been caught. I spun around just as the hidden door swung shut with a definitive click. The sound of a lock engaging echoed through the tunnel. My flashlight beam darted between the sealed door and the darkness ahead, where the footsteps grew closer. The article I'd come to write suddenly felt like a terrible mistake. In my research, I'd discovered something no one else had found. Now I realized too late that some stories aren't meant to be told, and some killers never work alone. Eastbrook Psychiatric Hospital hadn't seen a patient in 15 years, not since the scandal that forced its closure in 2009. I adjusted my camera bag as I ducked under the chain-link fence, its no trespassing sign swaying in the autumn wind. As a documentary photographer specializing in abandoned architecture, I'd captured hundreds of derelict buildings. But this place was different. This was where the Angel of Mercy killer had worked as a nurse for nearly a decade. The massive oak doors creaked open with surprising ease. The lobby still retained traces of its former grandeur. Marble floors beneath years of grime, a sweeping staircase that curved toward the upper floors, elaborate crown molding crumbling from water damage. A stack of patient files lay scattered across the reception desk, their pages yellow and curling. The killer had been meticulous with her paperwork, noting every medication she administered. That's how they finally caught her, through her own detailed records of death. The emergency lighting system still drew power from somewhere, casting a sickly glow through the corridors. An overturned wheelchair lay on its side, one wheel slowly turning in a draft I couldn't feel. The Angel of Mercy had worked primarily on the 4th floor in the long-term care ward. That's where she found her victims, patients who were too ill or sedated to resist when she increased their morphine drips to lethal levels. I found the 4th floor nurses' station exactly as it appeared in the crime scene photos. Medication charts still pinned to cork boards, ancient computer monitors covered in dust, cabinets hanging open from the police search. Prescription bottles littered the floor, their labels faded beyond recognition. According to the trial transcripts, she'd kept a secret log of her victims in a locked drawer. 27 confirmed deaths over 8 years, though prosecutors suspected the true number was much higher. Room 412 had been her favorite. The corner room's large windows offered a clear view of the cemetery behind the hospital, fitting, given how many of her victims ended up there. The iron bed frame remained, its thin mattress rotting. Full poles cast skeleton-like shadows on the walls. The killer had claimed she was relieving her patients' suffering, playing God with their pain medications until their breathing slowed to nothing. My flashlight beam caught something poking out from under the bed, a patient chart that somehow escaped the evidence collectors. The pages were stiff with dark stains I didn't want to identify. The name had been water damaged beyond recognition, but the date was clear, August 15th, 2009, 3 days after the hospital had officially closed. When they arrested her, she'd insisted there were more victims, ones they'd never found. The investigators had dismissed it as a ploy for attention. The shared bathroom between rooms 412 and 14 was a study in decay. Cracked mirrors multiplied my flashlight beam, creating disorienting patterns of light and shadow. Black mold crept across the ceiling like reaching fingers. The sink was stained rust red, though I told myself it was just oxidized pipes. The killer had sometimes disposed of leftover medications here, flushing the evidence of her overdoses down these very drains. A supply closet at the end of the hall caught my attention. Its door hung askew on broken hinges, revealing shelves of abandoned medical supplies. Shattered glass vials crunched under my boots as I stepped inside. Something about the dimensions seemed wrong. The closet was several feet shallower than it should have been, given the building's layout. I ran my hands along the back wall, feeling for irregularities. The wall panel shifted under my touch. A hidden door, disguised as part of the shelving unit. It swung open with a screech of rusty hinges, revealing a space that didn't appear on any of the hospital blueprints I'd studied. The beam of my flashlight illuminated a narrow room lined with filing cabinets. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and something else, something chemical and sweet. The filing cabinets were full of patient records, but these weren't official hospital documents. These were her private files, detailed notes on each victim, their reactions to increasing doses, how long they took to die. Some entries dated back to the 1990s, long before she'd started working at Eastbrook. My stomach lurched as I realized what I'd found, proof that her killing spree had begun much earlier at other hospitals. A door at the back of the secret room opened into what had once been a security monitoring station. Banks of screens sat dark and dead, their cables hanging like vines. A logbook lay open on the desk, its final entry stopping mid-sentence. The killer had known about this room. She'd used the camera feeds to time her deadly visits, ensuring no witnesses. Beyond the security room, a heavy metal door led to the hospital's old incinerator room. The massive cremation unit dominated the space, its iron door hanging open like a hungry mouth. Piles of ash still surrounded its base. During the trial, she'd hinted that some victims were never found because there was nothing left to find. The investigators had checked the incinerator, of course, but they'd been looking for recent remains. I knelt to photograph the ash piles and froze. Half buried in the gray powder was a plastic medical ID bracelet, warped from heat but still readable. The date stamped on it was from 1995, years before the earliest known victim. Next to it lay something else, small fragments of bone that had survived the flames. The killer wasn't lying about having more victims. She'd just hidden them better than anyone realized. A narrow stairwell behind the incinerator led down into darkness. It wasn't on any of the building plans I'd studied. The steps were slick with condensation, the air growing colder as I descended. The killer had been a model prisoner, earning privileges through good behavior. Last month, she'd escaped during a medical transport. The authorities were still searching, but I was beginning to understand why she might have come back here. At the bottom of the stairs, I found a door marked Morgue. A fresh handprint stood out against the rust, the dark fluid still wet. My camera slipped from suddenly numb fingers as I heard footsteps behind me. A voice spoke, as professional and calm as if she were still making her rounds. I was wondering when someone would find my private records. Now, let me show you where I kept the ones who didn't make it to the incinerator. I've been needing a new assistant. WKRX's broadcast tower pierced the darkening sky like a rusted needle. The old radio station hadn't transmitted a signal since 2013, when the Dead Air Killer case brought the station's dark history into the national spotlight. As a podcaster investigating cold cases, I'd spent months trying to gain access to the building. The property developer finally agreed to let me in before demolition began. One last chance to document the place where 7 people had vanished without a trace. The station's once iconic neon sign hung dark above the entrance, its letters spelling out WKX where the R had fallen years ago. Yellow crime scene tape, faded to almost white, still clung to the door frame in ragged strips. The killer had worked here as a night technician, using the station's late-night request show to lure victims. He'd tell them they'd won a contest, invite them to collect their prize after hours. None were ever seen leaving the building. The reception area was a time capsule of vintage radio. Vinyl records lay scattered across the floor, their covers warped from years of exposure to the elements. A display case of classic microphones had been shattered, presumably during the police investigation. The killer had been meticulous about cleaning up his crimes. No bodies, no blood, no evidence. Just 7 people who walked into the station between midnight and dawn, drawn by the promise of prizes that never existed. The main control room still housed its massive analog mixing board, now thick with dust and cobwebs. Cables hung from the ceiling like dead vines. This was where the killer had worked his technical magic, broadcasting his haunting late-night show while planning his next abduction. The police had discovered he'd modified the equipment somehow, using it to mask sounds from the station's basement, but they never figured out exactly what he'd done. Studio A's recording booth stood silent, its soundproofing foam hanging in tattered strips. The vintage RCA microphone remained suspended on its boom arm, its silver surface dulled with age. According to case files, this was where he'd conduct brief interviews with his victims before leading them downstairs to collect their prizes. He recorded each encounter, though the tapes were never found. The only evidence was a logbook listing names and times, discovered hidden behind the booth's wall panels. The service corridor leading to the basement was barely wide enough for one person. Emergency lights still drew power from the backup generator, casting an intermittent green glow that made the walls seem to pulse. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness, creating hollow echoes. The killer had known every inch of this building, using its maze-like layout to his advantage. His victims never had a chance to learn its secrets. The basement's main server room housed the guts of the station's broadcasting equipment. Metal racks lined the walls, filled with obsolete technology. A junction box hung open, exposing a rat's nest of modified wiring. The killer had been an electronics genius, using his technical skills to ensure nothing incriminating ever went out over the airwaves. But there were rumors about listeners who'd tuned in during the early morning hours, who claimed they'd heard strange sounds beneath the music. His workshop appeared undisturbed since the police investigation. Soldering equipment and specialized tools cluttered the workbench. An oscilloscope screen flickered weakly, somehow still drawing power. The killer had made modifications to standard broadcast equipment, creating devices whose purposes weren't immediately clear. The FBI's technical analysts had been baffled by some of his creations, found hidden throughout the station. The record storage room was a graveyard of broken vinyl. Collapsed shelves had spilled thousands of albums across the floor, their sharp edges glinting in my flashlight beam. A heavy metal door stood ajar in the back corner, the entrance to a sound-dampened vault where the station had stored its most valuable recordings. But according to the building plans, there should have been a solid wall there, not a door. The vault was lined with professional acoustic foam, the kind that absorbs all sound. Reel-to-reel tape machines lined one wall, their empty spools like staring eyes. The killer had used professional recording equipment, but these machines weren't here during the investigation. Someone had moved them in after the case went cold. The reels were labeled with dates that matched the disappearances. My hands trembled as I examined the nearest machine. The tape was threaded and ready to play. The label showed a date from 2013, the night the last victim disappeared. The killer had never been caught, had never revealed what he'd done with the bodies. But he'd been a sound engineer before working in radio. He'd known how to preserve audio perfectly. These tapes hadn't been here during the investigation. They were new. Moving the reel-to-reel machine revealed another door, this one hidden behind acoustic panels. It opened onto a space that shouldn't have existed, a room between rooms, perfectly soundproofed. The air was stale but disturbed, as if the door had been opened recently. On a table sat a modern digital recorder, its red light blinking, recording. Next to it lay a fresh logbook, open to today's date. The digital recorder was connected to the station's old broadcast equipment through a series of adapters and cables. A frequency counter displayed numbers I recognized, the same frequency WKRX had used for its late-night broadcast. But the station was dead, had been for years. Unless, I checked the equipment's settings, it was receiving, not transmitting. The killer hadn't been broadcasting out, he'd been listening in, waiting. A crackle of static made me jump. The equipment was picking up a signal. Impossible, unless someone was broadcasting to this specific frequency. Numbers scrolled across the digital display, forming a pattern I'd seen before, in the case files. The same sequence the killer had used to identify his victims. But these numbers were current, being transmitted right now. To this room. To me. The emergency exit sign cast a bloody glow down the corridor as I ran. My flashlight beam bounced wildly off the walls, creating a strobing effect that made the shadows seem to move. I could hear the static growing louder, coming from speakers I couldn't see. The numbers were still scrolling when I'd run, my press badge number, my car's license plate, my cell phone. He'd known I was coming. The dead air killer hadn't stopped claiming victims. He'd just been waiting for someone to find his new broadcast studio.